That. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Not in an envelope from an attorney's office, but delivered by Diane herself, standing in our kitchen with her arms crossed like she'd already rehearsed this moment 100 times. I remember looking at them sitting on the counter in their manila folder, thinking about how much of a marriage can be reduced to a stapled stack of pages and legal terms. Irreconcilable differences. She'd circled it in pen. I spent 30 years building something with this woman. Not just a house or a life, but a whole identity built around being the kind of man who stayed, who provided, who didn't ask for much in return. And somewhere between the mortgage payments and the children growing up and my body getting older and my body getting older, she decided that version of me wasn't enough anymore. That Tuesday morning, she told me she wanted a fresh start. A real life, she called it. I remember thinking our 30 years together must have felt pretty fake by that point. Before I get into what happened next, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments, I'd like to know. All right, let me take you back to how we got here. I grew up in a military family. My father was Army, stationed at various bases throughout the 60s and 70s. We moved 11 times before I finished high school. By the time I was 17, I'd learned that home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's just whoever shows up when things get hard. When I turned 18, I joined the Army myself, not because anyone pushed me. It just seemed like the natural progression. Men in my family served. That's what we did. I spent 27 years in uniform. Most of those years, I kept quiet about what I'd actually experienced. My generation wasn't raised to talk about those things. We carried it, we managed it, and we definitely didn't broadcast our struggles to the people we loved. That's just how it was done back then. I met Diane at a charity gala in downtown Denver in the spring of 1994. She was volunteering, helping organize silent auction items, and I remembered being struck by how comfortable she looked in a room full of strangers. She wore a dark blue dress and had this way of making people feel like they mattered just by listening to them. Later that evening, a mutual friend introduced us. She laughed at a stupid joke I made about the artwork being displayed. I said something about modern art looking like someone had sneezed on a canvas. Most people would have politely smiled and moved on. She actually laughed, really laughed. And I remember thinking right then that I wanted to spend more time with someone who could appreciate that kind of humor. We didn't have much in common on paper. She came from money, not old money, but the kind built by her parents' hard work in real estate and business. I was still an active duty soldier at that point, 27 years old, driving a used truck with mismatched tires, living on a junior officer's salary. But she didn't seem to care about any of that. She said she liked that I made her feel safe, that I took things seriously without taking myself too seriously. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a church in Colorado Springs, close to Fort Carson where I was stationed. Those early years were good. Real good. We bought a small house in a quiet suburb south of Denver. Nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, a detached garage where I eventually set up a workshop. She started her own marketing and event planning business. Small at first, working out of our spare bedroom. I'd come home from the base, and she'd be there surrounded by fabric samples and vendor contracts, talking through ideas out loud like I was her personal business consultant. I didn't know anything about what she was doing, but I liked listening to her think. We had our son Chris in 1998. I was gone for half his childhood. That's the part of military service nobody really talks about. Not the combat, not the loss, but missing the everyday moments with your kids. I missed his first day of school. I missed his Little League championships. I missed a lot of Christmas mornings. Diane handled most of it alone. She never complained about it to me. Maybe that was the first crack. Maybe she was already storing up resentment about all those absences, and I just didn't know it yet. After I retired in 1997, things were supposed to get easier. That's what everyone said. You finish your service, you settle down, and you finally get to just be a regular person with a normal life. But that's not how it works for a lot of guys who spent as much time in uniform as I did. The transition was harder than I expected. The nightmares got worse after I left the army, not better. Crowded shopping centers started giving me panic attacks. Some mornings I'd sit in my truck in the parking lot of Home Depot for an hour, trying to build up the nerve to walk inside. Diane started making comments about how withdrawn I'd become, how I seemed distant, how I didn't engage with her or with our son anymore. She was right, but I didn't know how to explain it. I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I was carrying things I didn't have words for. By the time Chris went to college at CU Boulder in 2016, the marriage was already hollow. Diane had channeled all her energy into building her business. It had become successful, really successful. She had a team of people working for her, corporate clients, events that took her all over Colorado. And somewhere in that success, she became embarrassed by me. An old veteran who volunteered at the Veterans Resource Center and wore the same green jacket every winter. She'd talk about her friends from the business community, their husbands, things they had, the places they traveled. And I could see her mentally comparing her life to theirs, like maybe she'd made a mistake sticking with me. The distance grew. She stopped wanting to sit together on the porch in the evenings. She stopped asking how my day was. Sex became something that happened maybe 4 times a year, and even then it felt obligatory. I tried to talk to her about it once, about how we seemed to be drifting. She told me I was paranoid, that I was reading too much into normal changes, that not every marriage had to feel like a romance novel. I should have pushed harder on that conversation, but I didn't. Men from my generation were taught that persistence in emotional conversations is just nagging. So I let it go, and somewhere in that silence, the foundation stopped being a foundation and started being a structure held together just by habit. In 2022, our mountain cabin, this beautiful little place we'd bought up in Evergreen back in the early 2000s, needed serious repairs. The roof was failing, the plumbing was shot, and it would have cost us $45,000 to fix it properly. Diane wanted to sell it. Her business had hit a rough patch after COVID, and she was worried about cash flow. I sold it without much argument. That cabin meant something to me. I'd spent some of the best days of my life up there, working on it with my hands, clearing the property, making it something whole. But it meant more to me, to keep Diane's anxiety at bay. Chris never knew about the sale. When he asked me later that year why we'd let it go, I told him I just thought it was time. I didn't tell him about the sacrifice. Men of my generation became experts at that kind of thing, carrying the cost, not mentioning it. Last year, Diane asked for a divorce while we were having coffee on a Saturday morning. Not an argument, not a breakdown, just a straightforward request delivered between sips of her latte. "I've wasted enough time," she said. "I need a real life now." I remember nodding slowly because I honestly didn't know what else to do. How do you argue with someone who's already made up their mind? I agreed to let her keep the house. I agreed to split my pension. I agreed to everything she asked for, because honestly, by that point, I didn't have the energy to fight that. But that's when things got ugly. Her attorney, a guy named Steve Hartley, who wore his ambition like a too-tight suit, decided that agreeing to everything wasn't enough. He wanted blood. He started digging, filing motions, requesting financial records, pushing for a larger share of my pension, based on the argument that my PTSD made me unstable and unfit to manage finances. He painted this picture of me as a damaged veteran who'd emotionally neglected his wife for 30 years. And in some ways, he wasn't lying. I had neglected her, just not in the way he was describing. The divorce hearing was scheduled for September in the El Paso County Courthouse in Colorado Springs. The night before, I drove out there and sat in the parking lot for an hour. The courthouse was this old brick building, solid and official-looking. I remember thinking about how strange it was that our entire marriage was going to be decided inside those walls by a stranger in a black robe. The next morning, Diane showed up in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my truck. She looked confident, untouchable, like she'd already figured out how to be a version of herself that didn't include me at all. We sat across from each other at a table with our attorneys between us, like some kind of buffer zone. Then Hartley stood up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice that smooth, practiced tone that made everything sound reasonable and terrible at the same time. My client has endured decades of emotional abandonment from a man whose military service has left him psychologically incapable of genuine intimacy. Mrs. Morrison is entitled to full custodianship of their assets and a generous settlement because, frankly, she's the one who held this marriage together while her husband checked out. I remember the judge. His name was Thomas Reeves, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and glasses that he kept adjusting, writing something down on a legal pad. He wasn't looking at me. That was the part that hurt most. Like I was barely worth acknowledging, then Diane spoke, and what she said stopped everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and cold, "My husband is basically a worthless veteran who couldn't even be bothered to show up for his own marriage." The silence that followed was complete. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A couple of reporters in the back of the courtroom looked at each other like they couldn't believe what they'd heard. And Judge Reeves, he looked up from his pad with this strange expression on his face. I remember Diane's eyes finally meeting mine for just a second. And in that second, I saw something flicker across her face. Maybe regret. Maybe just the realization that she'd said something she couldn't take back. Then she looked away. I'd sat there with my hands folded on the table, not moving, not reacting. What I wanted to do was stand up and walk out of that courtroom. What I actually did was take a slow breath and look directly at Judge Reeves. "Your Honor," I said quietly, "do you remember a night in September of 2013? The judge's pen stopped moving. He looked up at me like he was trying to place me. I wasn't anyone he'd know socially. I was just another old man in a hearing aid and an off-the-rack suit. Then I saw it, the exact moment recognition hit his face. His skin went pale. Not just pale white, like all the blood had drained straight out of him. He stood up so fast, his chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind the bench. "Oh my God!" he whispered, and then, louder, "Dick Patterson." Hartley's face went through a series of expressions in quick succession. Confusion. Panic. Something that looked like he suddenly realized he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. "We're taking a 15-minute recess," Judge Reeves said abruptly. He didn't ask for input from anyone. Now, he disappeared through a side door without looking back. The courtroom erupted into whispers immediately. I just sat there, feeling every one of my 67 years settle into my bones like they were finally admitting how tired I actually was. Diane leaned toward me, her face confused now instead of confident. "What was that about?" "Nothing," I said. "Just something from a long time ago." "You know him?" Hartley asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Explain this to me right now." I didn't explain anything. I just sat there quietly while people around me tried to piece together what had just happened. It takes 23 years to forget something completely. I've learned that now. Before September 2013, I would have said 30 years is enough time for the past to stop mattering. But the past doesn't work that way. Sometimes it's just sitting there waiting, like a chess move someone made years ago that's finally moving across the board toward you. September 2013 was the Colorado Front Range floods. If you lived through it, you remember. If you didn't, imagine this: water coming down from the mountains with the force of something that had been held back too long. Creeks turning into rivers overnight. Neighborhoods disappearing under muddy water. The highways washed out, neighborhoods evacuated, people trapped in their cars on roads that turned into canyons of flowing debris. I was stationed at Fort Carson at that time, working with the Army Corps of Engineers on emergency response and evacuation support. Thomas Reeves wasn't military then. He was a young federal prosecutor, maybe 30 years old, sharp as a knife, ambitious in that quiet way that gets things done. He was in Colorado Springs, investigating some contractor fraud case, and got caught in the evacuation chaos when the flooding started moving southeast toward the city, faster than anyone expected. We got the call that civilians were stranded near Widefield, caught in their cars when the water had risen around them too fast. By the time we got to them, it was dark. Rain was coming sideways. The current was ripping everything loose. Trees, sections of road, pieces of people's lives just flowing downstream. My commanding officer ordered us to pull back and wait for daylight. Standard. Protocol. I didn't follow that order. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was courage or stupidity. Maybe they're the same thing at certain moments. I took 2 soldiers and we launched an inflatable rescue raft into water that looked more like a weapon than a neighborhood street. Pitch black, rain like needles, power lines arcing in the distance, the roar of water that doesn't care about buildings or cars or human beings. Reeves was there with 3 other people. A woman in her 70s, a young couple in their 20s. He was holding the elderly woman with one arm and trying to keep everyone together with the other. He was terrified. I could see it on his face, but he wasn't letting go of her. "We're getting out of here," I yelled over the noise. Everyone in the raft now. The young couple went first, then the elderly woman. Reeves was last. He was exhausted, hypothermic, barely able to move. As I was pulling him aboard, he lost his grip and the current caught him. I had to reach way out over the edge of the raft and grab his jacket. My shoulder tore something on that pull. Some kind of rotator cuff injury. The cold water probably helped numb it at first. I didn't realize how bad it was until later. We got everyone to higher ground. Emergency services took over from there. Reeves went to a hospital. I went back to base and didn't think much about it after that. You don't, in situations like that. You do the job and move on. That's how you survive in the military. You don't spend time replaying moments or looking for meaning in them. You just keep moving forward. 23 years later, he was sitting on the bench in a divorce courtroom about to watch a woman tear apart her husband in front of everyone. And he remembered me. Bailiff led me through a narrow hallway lined with photographs of past judges. The courthouse had that smell of old buildings and stale coffee. Judge Reeves's chambers were smaller than I expected. Nothing fancy, just books and family photographs, and some personal items arranged in a way that suggested he actually spent time thinking in that space. The moment the door closed, he just stared at me like he was trying to confirm I was real. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "Dick Patterson." "Judge," I said. He shook his head slowly, like he couldn't believe it. "You got old." I almost laughed at that. That makes two of us. And then something I didn't expect happened. Judge Thomas Reeves stepped forward and hugged me. Not a professional hug, not something careful or polite. A real hug. The kind older men only give when words have already given up. "You saved my life," he said quietly. I looked at the floor. It was a long time ago. "Not to me," he said, and I could hear his voice shake a little. "I've thought about that night for 23 years, Dick. 23 years. He walked back behind his desk slowly and sat down, still studying me. "I searched for you afterward," he admitted. "For years. That caught me off guard." "You did?" "I wanted to thank you properly. The hospital kept records, but your name was listed wrong or something, and by the time I tracked it down, you'd transferred. I tried a couple more times, but life got busy. Career, family, the usual stuff. But I never forgot." He leaned back in his chair. "You remember that night? When it rains heavy, do you remember? Every time I thought. Every time the water comes hard, I'm right back there in the dark." "Every time," I said. Reeves nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He opened a desk drawer and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, I saw a military medallion sitting in his palm. It was tarnished with age, but still recognizable. "You gave me this in the ambulance," Reeves said. Said something like, "You survived, so now you owe something back to the world." I've carried that for 23 years. I remember giving it to him. I'd been young, idealistic, in a way I'm not anymore. I believed that meant something. The idea that if you made it through, you had an obligation to make it matter. "What happened to you, Dick?" Reeves asked quietly. He wasn't asking about my marriage or my medical history. He was asking about all of it. The time that passed, the man I stopped being, tired version that was sitting in his office. I could have answered in a lot of ways. But I went with the truth. I got tired. Reeves understood that immediately. Men our age always do. "Did you ever threaten your wife?" he asked next. "No." "Hide assets?" "No." "Emotionally abuse her?" I looked him in the eye. "Never. I was absent. I was quiet when I should have talked. But I never hurt her intentionally." He nodded. "That's what I thought." Outside the window, I could hear distant thunder. Storm season in Colorado. Sky was doing that thing where clouds build up over the mountains and promise rain. "Your wife's attorney is going to argue that your military service left you mentally unfit," Reeves said. "That you're unstable because of PTSD. That didn't surprise me. It was a strategy. Make the old veteran look crazy, and then the wife looks like the victim." "Are you angry?" Reeves asked. "That." I thought about Diane sitting out there in the courtroom. The woman who laughed at bad jokes. The woman I'd spent 30 years trying to provide for and protect. The woman who'd decided somewhere along the way that protecting me back wasn't worth her effort. "No," I said honestly. "I'm mostly sad." Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a folder and opened it on his desk. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Handwritten, typed, folded with age, different colors of paper, different handwriting. He didn't hand them to me, but I could see they were addressed to him. After you retired, I heard from people, Reeves said carefully. Young soldiers you'd helped, career officers who said you'd mentored them. A former Marine who wrote that you talked him out of suicide. A widow who said you paid her mortgage when her husband died. A young specialist whose addiction recovery you funded anonymously. He looked up at me. People don't forget men like you, Dick. They remember. I couldn't speak for a second. The truth is, after you spend enough years feeling like you don't matter, you start believing it. You create this story in your mind about how invisible you've become, that. And then someone shows you a folder full of evidence that you were seen the whole time. This case isn't about money, Reeves said quietly. It's about dignity, and I'm going to make sure you get it back. When we walked back into the courtroom together, the entire room went silent. Not regular quiet, that. The kind of silence people make when they know something important happened behind closed doors. Even if they can't figure out what, Diane's face changed immediately. Not fear, exactly, but something like the moment before fear. Uncertainty. The realization that she'd been operating with incomplete information. Hartley stood up immediately. Your Honor, I need to lodge a formal objection regarding judicial impartiality. You may object, Reeves said calmly. I'm still proceeding as scheduled. That shut everything down fast. The hearing continued, but something had shifted in the room. Testimony about finances and pensions and property divisions. The usual mathematics of a marriage being dismantled, that. But underneath it all, tension kept building like pressure behind a dam. Finally, Hartley decided to press his advantage one more time. He thought he could control the narrative if he just pushed hard enough. He always thought that. Mr. Patterson, he said smoothly, would you agree that your emotional withdrawal contributed to the failure of this marriage? Yes, I answered calmly. He seemed surprised by how easily I admitted it. He pressed harder. And you'd agree that your military service has left you psychologically damaged? Yes, I said again. Hartley turned toward the judge like he'd already won. Your Honor, the witness has clearly stated his incapacity to maintain a healthy marriage. But then Diane spoke up, quietly from her side of the courtroom. That's enough. Everyone turned toward her. Even Hartley looked confused. She sat straighter in her chair. Your Honor, I need to say something. Mrs. Morrison, Hartley said quickly, I advise against. I don't care, she interrupted. Her voice was shaking now. You've spent the last hour making my husband sound like a monster. Like he's some damaged veteran who couldn't be bothered to show up for his marriage. And that's not, she stopped, swallowed hard. That's not the truth. The courtroom went completely still. Frank wasn't cruel, she continued, and I realized she'd used my actual name for maybe the first time in a year. He wasn't abusive, he was just quiet. He carried things I never bothered to ask about. She was looking at me now. Her eyes had that watery quality that meant she was barely holding it together. I spent our entire marriage comparing us to other people, she admitted. Women with richer husbands, bigger houses, more interesting lives. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing Anne, who I actually married. Hartley looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. This was supposed to be his win. This was supposed to be simple. He sold our mountain cabin to save the house when my business failed, Diane said quietly. Did you know that? He sold something that meant everything to him because I was anxious about money. She wiped her eyes, and I never even thanked him for it. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I felt my chest tighten immediately when I saw it. It was the letter I'd written her 6 years earlier. The the one I'd never had the courage to actually give her. The one I'd written on a night when the nightmares were particularly bad and I couldn't sleep, so I'd sat in the kitchen trying to explain things to her on paper since I couldn't explain them out loud. "Did you write this?" she asked me, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded once. She unfolded it carefully, her hands shaking, and read aloud. "I know living with me hasn't always been easy. Sometimes I feel like I left parts of myself overseas and never quite brought them home. But I need you to know that none of that was ever your fault. I loved you before any of this started, and despite everything, I still do." By the time she finished, even Hartley looked uncomfortable. "Why didn't you give this to me?" Diane asked. I answered honestly. I didn't think the words mattered anymore. And that was maybe the saddest thing that came out of my mouth that whole day. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I was standing on the porch of my rented cabin in Evergreen, which is about 40 minutes west of Denver, looking out at the mountains and thinking about how peace and loneliness can look almost identical from a distance. The cabin was small. 1 bedroom, kitchen where you could touch both walls if you stretched, a porch swing that had seen better days. But it was quiet. Not the hostile kind of quiet that lived in the house with Diane, but the actual kind. The kind that helps you think. I'd sold the main house to Diane without much argument. Too many memories lived there. 30 years of a marriage that had slowly transformed into something neither of us recognized anymore. I didn't need it. Instead, I started spending most of my time volunteering at the Veterans Resource Center in Denver. It wasn't glamorous work. Mostly paperwork, helping other veterans navigate VA claims, organizing filing systems, giving rides to appointments. But there was something honest about it. These men and women didn't care what my job used to be or whether my marriage had failed. They just needed someone who understood the particular exhaustion of carrying things for too long. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, Linda showed up at the center. Not Diane. Linda was from the story I'm trying to forget. Diane was the woman standing in the doorway holding a tray of coffee. She looked smaller than she had in the courtroom. Like something in her had deflated slightly. The room got awkward immediately. A few of the older veterans recognized her from the hearing coverage. One of them, Art Benedetti, an 80-year-old former Navy man who was mean as a cut rope but soft underneath, pointed toward an empty table. "Well," he said gruffly, "don't just stand there blocking the doorway. Sit." She began volunteering after that, not because we reconciled, but because I think she was trying to understand something about me that she'd missed for 30 years. She worked alongside the veterans, helping with intake forms, answering phones, organizing supply donations. She was good at it. She actually listened to people. One afternoon, I watched her sit with a widow for nearly 2 hours, just listening, while the woman talked about losing her husband in combat decades earlier. Diane didn't try to fix it or offer advice. She just sat there, present, the way I wish she'd been able to do for me during all those years. Chris noticed the shift first. He called me one Sunday evening, and I could hear something different in his voice. "Dad," he said, "I can actually talk to both of you now without feeling like I'm walking through a minefield. That's really nice." "Your mum's a good person," I said. "I think we both just forgot how to be good to each other." "Maybe," Chris said, "but I think she's remembering now." A few months later, Chris and his wife brought Hannah to visit. Hannah was our granddaughter, 10 years old at that point. All questions and observations about how the world worked. She'd spent most of her life watching her grandparents not speak to each other, so she was cautious at first. But over the course of the visit, watching Diane and me interact with something resembling kindness, she slowly opened up. One afternoon, she and I were sitting on the porch of my cabin, working on a puzzle that neither of us was particularly good at, when she asked me something that stuck with me. "Grandpa, were you really a hero?" she asked. "Mom," said Judge Morgan, "talked about you in assembly." I almost laughed. "No, sweetheart, I was just doing my job." "But he said you saved people." I baited the hook on my fishing rod carefully. We were planning to head out to a local creek later. "Saving people doesn't make you a hero," I said. "Lots of people do brave things. What matters more is what you do when nobody's watching." She frowned at the puzzle. "What do you mean?" "I mean being kind when it's easier not to be, staying when you could leave, admitting when you're wrong. That's the stuff that actually matters." She seemed satisfied with that answer. Kids usually are. They understand simple truths better than adults. A few weeks later, her school held a Veterans Day assembly. Nothing fancy. Elementary school gymnasium with folding chairs, paper flags taped to walls, coffee in styrofoam cups. Kind of American gathering I actually enjoy, if I'm being honest. "Emma, sorry, I keep doing that. I mean Hannah. Hannah begged me to come. She'd found out veterans would be recognized. I almost declined. Crowds still tire me out. But she gave me that look granddaughters use when they already know you're going to say yes eventually. Diane came too. We sat beside each other awkwardly near the back of the gymnasium. Not quite touching, but close enough that people would understand we'd found some kind of peace. Principal spoke about service and sacrifice. Then she said something that may want to disappear. "We have a special guest speaker today," the principal announced. "Please welcome Judge Thomas Reeves." I closed my eyes. Judge Reeves, of course. Of all the schools in the Denver metro area, he somehow knew about this one. He walked to the microphone in a dark suit, found me immediately in the crowd, and smiled that smile that told me he was about to make a point at my expense, whether I liked it or not. He spoke for a few minutes about service and community, and how real strength is often quiet, the usual things. Then he paused. "I'd like to tell you all something," he said. "Several months ago, I watched a courtroom full of people underestimate someone because he looked like an ordinary old man. I already knew better. I felt Diane tense beside me. Too late now, I thought. But strength rarely announces itself loudly." Reeves continued. "In my experience, the strongest people are often the quietest people in the room." "Dick Patterson, would you stand for a moment?" I sighed heavily while Hannah practically bounced out of her seat with excitement. As I stood, the gymnasium erupted in applause. Not wild or performative. Something quieter, more meaningful. Teachers and students and parents acknowledging something they didn't fully understand, but could sense was important. I glanced toward Diane. Tears filled her eyes again, but not the tears of guilt from the courtroom. These looked like understanding. After the ceremony, Hannah slipped her small hand into mine while we walked outside beneath the Colorado sun, that particular quality of light you get in the mountains when the day is ending, but still bright. "Grandpa," she whispered proudly, "everybody likes you." I laughed softly. "Well, don't trust that too much, sweetheart." Later that evening, Diane came by the cabin with a small wooden box. "I found this while cleaning the attic," she said. "I thought you might want it." Inside sat my old American flag from retirement, carefully preserved, completely untouched. The kind of thing you keep in case it ever means something again. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, Then she said the words I think both of us had needed most. "I'm sorry I stopped seeing you clearly." I nodded slowly. "And I'm sorry I stopped letting you." The sun dipped low over the mountains. Gold light filled the porch. Together, we carefully unfolded the flag for Hannah and showed her how to fold it properly into a triangle the way my father once taught me. 3 generations standing quietly together at sunset, learning something about love that doesn't require words. Maybe that was enough. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a veteran, a spouse, a parent, or just someone quiet, carrying burdens nobody else can see, I hope you'll take a moment to tell them they matter while there's still time. Because sometimes the people holding families together the longest are the exact people the world never bothers to notice, until it's almost too late.